This is Leading Detection, a Sedulo podcast where fraud fighters talk tech. Welcome back to the Leading Detection podcast. Today, we're joined by Dustin, and we're going to be talking about orchestrating fraud detection. Dustin, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure is mine.
Awesome. So orchestrating fraud detection. What's brought us here today to talk about that? Why is it important?
Yeah, I think it's important because, for years, we've tried to address the fraud challenge in kind of these silos or in isolation, right? Departments, tools, processes, they kind of all lived in their respective corners, if you will. And as technology has advanced, the ability to be able to really understand the customer journey, touch points in a more holistic way is really revolutionizing, in my opinion, both the fraud and financial playing field. It's really putting us maybe at a little bit more of an advantage than ever before. So essentially what orchestration is the ability to be able to take maybe point solutions, data points, other things, and to be able to bring those all together to get a true understanding of a risk of a customer, right? Instead of, again, living in isolation where you're saying, onboarding, this is a risk that I'm experiencing, or this transaction, this is a risk I'm experiencing. You're able to really collectively get all those data points and again, understand that respective fraud. I mean, let's be honest, fraudsters they should be working at banks, doing gap analysis and, penetration testing because they're really good at finding those gaps. And that's what the history of tools that supply really these point solution opportunities have created is these gaps, unfortunately.
So you spoke about point solutions. If we start with the basics, what are they, where do they come from, and what do they kind of look like now?
Yeah, so point solutions essentially are, and they undoubtedly they are important, and they still exist as a critical infrastructure to, let's say, a fraud stack or the orchestration, right? Because there is best in class point solutions that exist that just have some proprietary data. They might have just a better way of identifying the fraud. They're keeping up with the times as technology continues to iterate. So essentially, these point solutions are there to address a particular problem or solve a particular challenge, right? So, as an example, a point solution might be an IDV vendor that's there to collect identity, maybe a selfie, maybe some other type of data point. But essentially, that's what it's for. It's a point in time within the customer journey. Or there might be a tool that's maybe down funnel, right? That's looking at risky transactions. And that's what it does best. Those are great. But again, if you're looking at just that data point, I think you miss some of the full picture, right? It's like going on a date and then only asking a few questions about their high school, but they've already went through college. They've already, to miss a tremendous amount about this person. That's the same for me, in my opinion, when it comes to fraud.
So why is it front of mind now? What's changed recently that there's a big focus on getting all these tools to talk to each other rather than just having best in class?
I think there's been concepts in history that have wanted this or leaned towards. Like a perfect example would be like Framel, right? Where this idea of fraud and AML working together collectively. The challenge again continued to be that the departments were siloed, the processes were siloed, the tools were siloed. So the idea here is that the technology didn't keep up with the thoughts, right? What was envisioned, what was hoped for. Now, as we introduce AI into the picture, into the tools, it really creates an environment where you can have the processing power, the computations, the decisions in such first of all, to be woven together, right? The complexity has kind of been removed, and the ability for these tools to speak to each other has also been removed as these technologies have really improved. I mean, you think about this isn't necessarily fraud related, but when AI agents were trying to do financial spreading, a very complicated credit process, maybe 2 years ago, a year ago. They just couldn't do it. The LLMs could not do it. Now they can. They literally come out with a new version, right? Seems like every day your
Every hour.
LLM is getting an update, right? Or hourly. And then all of a sudden the breakthrough happens. And that's really what's happened over the last, I would say, 12 months or
Mm.
less. The technology has really accelerated to the point where you can finally get a holistic view of a customer.
I mean, in theory, it sounds great. So you've got best in class in every area. You've got the best device intelligence. You've got the best transaction monitoring. But what's the catch? What's the bottleneck? Where's the challenge coming from?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge will still be from a technical lift perspective, right? You got to be able to still create the pipes to have the data flow in. And the other challenge is the tools and the orchestration is only as good as your data, right? At the end of the day, like there's a lot of people that think I'm going to use AI to solve my problems. I'm going to get an LLM and it's going to solve my problems, right? The fact of the matter is if the data is bad, it just won't work. So you still have to make sure that you've done your foundational building blocks and ensuring that your data is good. And then once your data is good, it's now stitching together those weak points or touch points of your customer that you really want to address. The other
Mm.
thing is like, when I was interviewed by a magazine recently, the Compliance and Ethics Professionals, one of my quotes in there is that fraud doesn't recognize organizational boundaries. So our defenses can't either. We can't think of things within a confine of like, I want to address onboarding. You just can't. Or I want to, address a first party fraud. Like you really have to look at all those touch points. I was sitting at dinner in New York just last week with a large consultancy firm, and one of the things they told me is like, now that there's a tool like yours, like I really want to be able to solve a more robust set of touch points
Mm.
within a customer journey. Like there is these whole issues happening in these data centers or these call centers, I mean,
Yeah.
where customers are calling in and they're really the fake customers, that is, and they're getting information. They keep calling back. They keep calling back. But if you had maybe some data that was upstream that you could leverage, oh, the customer's age, this isn't common for the customer. The behaviors show that this customer only interacts with customer service once a month, and
Mm.
then you see this spike, right, of 20 calls
Yeah.
and they drop, or they come call in again. They're looking for another agent. They're systematically chipping away at gathering intelligence to then do maybe an ATO, right? Account
Mhm.
takeover or something else, right? So these are the things that if you have, again, just a tool that's living in one environment and not some of the others, you might miss these signals. It isn't, there's still lots to learn. There's still lots to do in the industry, but again, it gives you a better ability to find the control breakdowns that exist within your organization and fill them with tools and ensure the data points are available at any point in time in the customer
Mhm.
journey.
So if we're going to put a headline, fraud is a data problem, can we be as bold as that?
Yeah, I definitely think that that is a major part of what exists, right? The data is a problem. Either it is not clean or it is not available to other teams or different parts of the organization for whatever reason, right? For them, maybe because they just can't stitch it together or whatever. But yes, data is undoubtedly an underlying challenge.
Yeah, it kind of leads me to something I've been curious about. So if we look at big banks, they've got the budget, they've got the headcount, they've got the data, right? So why are they going wrong and just building these systems themselves?
Well, I think there is a lot of individuals in the industry that love to build, right? It is really fun to build. The challenge that I think that organizations face as they build is, they realize, especially in the big banks, right? You have so many checks and balances that exist along the way. It really slows things down, and technology is just undoubtedly moving faster than it ever has. I really think we're at the precipice in time that we'll talk to our kids and grandkids and great grandkids about like, we lived through this experience, this AI revolution, if you will. It really will be something that we speak about for decades and beyond. But when they're going through this process, they're not moving fast enough. So that's undoubtedly one challenge. The other challenge is the technical debt that exists. If you've worked for one of these big banks before, you know that you, first of all, as a team, right? AML fraud often don't get the budgets that maybe sales does or other teams. So
What's
they
that?
don't get the priorities to iterate, to evolve, to change, to modify, like that you need in these respective tools. So the technical debt that exists is, I think, not fully understood as the pace continues to increase. And then again, as departments have requests and needs and iterations, they just don't get prioritized. And then you have this antiquated, lethargic kind of legacy tool that doesn't do what you need it to do.
Is there places where building does make sense?
Yeah, I think there is areas where it does make sense, right? There might be some data, internal data, right, that is really pertinent and really valuable that you want to be able to build a little bit more. Maybe you want to make some customized models that are, again, relevant because you serve a really niche specific sector, right? There's things that you just can't get out there. There's no vendor that can supplement what you have internally, right? I know that I've worked for fintechs that provide maybe banking services to new to country, right? There really isn't a lot of their data there. Like, can a credit bureau give you much? No, there is. It's a thin file, if a file at all, right? And then there's also behaviors that historically banks have considered maybe higher risk. Maybe this community is very cash intensive. But this is commonplace for them, right? From their countries and their areas of cultural experience,
Mm.
cash is king. It's how they do things. But this would, for many traditional banks, be considered very risky behavior. But when you take it into context for your customers and that
Mhm.
internal data that you've collected over years of serving these customers, you could clearly see that this is not a high risk customer or that behavior is normal.
Yeah, nice. Let's um let's talk a little bit about your journey. You've gone from, I could say, a point solution to an end-to-end solution. You've gone from credit decisions now to handling the whole customer journey. Have we got that right?
Yeah, that's pretty right. I mean, Tactile started as an organization that really focused on credit decisioning. That is actually, ironically, where I started my career in the financial service industry is credit decisioning. And then I quickly saw this cool group sitting over there doing this fraud stuff.
Yeah.
And then I moved from there to, the credit decisioning over to the fraud as an analyst.
Mhm.
And I got to use Falcon. I just totally dated myself by calling out Falcon as the first fraud tool I ever used.
Yeah.
But the same with Tactile, right? Like they started with the credit decisioning and then they quickly realized that there is a vastly larger world to play in, right?
Mm.
That's decisions weren't just credit decisions that could be made. There's onboarding decisions, there's financial crimes decisions, transactions decisions, all these things that could be stitched together, orchestrated under a singular umbrella that could provide an institution with clear insights around risk and behavior.
Yeah. I think I'm going to quote you there, by the way, saying that fraud fighters are the cool kids. We'll click that bit. So, yeah, what's the hardest part about bringing all these different steps, different vendors together?
Yeah, I think some of the difficulty is that there is a lot of player. I mean, this field is vastly filled with a ton of solutions, right? So there's a lot out there. And so for me, one of the things that I'm tasked with a team that I help with in this is really just deciding who we want to partner with, right? Who really has the expertise to provide the value to our customers. Because it wouldn't make any sense for me to recommend a point solution in that orchestration that wasn't a best in class or didn't provide a good level of product readiness and availability of good quality data. So that's kind of some of the challenges. Just getting inundated by all these different vendors and wanting to play in the space and then decisioning which ones would be the best to
Mm.
decide. But again, it also depends on the organization. There might be a cost issue, right? Where we just need to select a sanctions or fraud vendor that's just more affordable versus, these legacy big players that can do a lot more bells and whistles. For maybe a large institution, that might be more
Yeah.
affordable. So It's great to be able to kind of stitch those together with their respective needs, maturity of their teams, those kinds of things. But what's really great about it in the environment that exists is, let's be honest, salespeople like to sell, right? And they're good at it. That's why they do what they do. But when you have a product that you're on the fence with, one of the great things about Tactile is the ability to be able to take, let's say, two competing products. They both say they're really good at synthetic or really good at fraud of some sort or another, right? You can bring them into the Tactile environment and do essentially a test between the two. Which one performs better? Which one really gives me the true fraud versus kind of this noise that exists all too often in the tools? And then at that point, you decide which one you want to deploy in your environment, because you now have the proof to say this one's going to perform the way I expect it to be. And this is really powerful. I think another area where it really changes the game, because in the past it's kind of like you kind of got to go with what they're selling you. You're hoping it's going to do it. You might do a proof of concept, but the reality of it is it still could be limited. It still could give you not the results that you're expecting, or the level of detail that you want, versus having that ability to test two players at the same time is really empowering to teams.
Mm. It's crazy out there at the minute, the amount of vendors, the amount of tools. Do you think that's good for the industry? Because fraud, it's a problem, growing problem. The cost of committing fraud is getting close to zero. The cost of fighting fraud is climbing exponentially. So is it good that there's this amount of tools out there so we can have options, we can have competing on price, or is it just too loud?
I mean, gosh, there's probably a ton of opinions out there, but I would say that we live in a world where there's a marketplace. There needs to be competition. I think that's something we want to see.
Yeah.
However, I do feel like there is undoubtedly a crowded field. There probably needs to be some contraction, there probably needs to be some tools that maybe just need to get swallowed up by some of the bigger players that are so, v- fairly closely aligned, right? So the distinction probably doesn't need to be made, and that will probably undoubtedly happen over the next 12 to 24 months. I think you'll start to see in the industry kind of these best in class tools edge ahead, and it'll be enough to kind of push some of those out, or it will allow for them to make some acquisitions, right? Some mergers and so forth. So I think that's where we're getting. I think we've had periods like this before. I just feel like right now, because of the ease in which you can create a product, right? Like coding, you don't even need to know coding anymore, right? You can go to your favorite LLM or AI tool and do it for you. So there, a lot of that technical lift has kind of been removed, and there's a lot of people that are trying to solve a lot of problems. That's why there's so many different fintechs too, right? They're trying to solve all these respective challenges that maybe traditional banks have not been able to serve. But the thing is that the cost to do that is getting more affordable. So I actually think that you'll probably see, and I think we've seen it just recently, right, with the Brex acquisition, that you'll start to see these big banks make acquisitions strategically because they want to enter into those markets, and now they're kind of maybe more affordable because the technology or the ability to do it is a little bit easier for them. So I think you're going to see that with the vendors as well. You're going to start seeing these technical acquisitions.
Do you think it's to be an open question, but when something becomes best in class, it does super well at what it's doing. And where does it go from there? It starts going into different markets, different areas. Is that an issue as well?
Well, I do think there's two roads that companies often take, and sometimes they take them both. Is that you get these companies that could become the best in class, and they become comfortable in
Mm.
their position, and then they slowly but surely stop iterating. They become much like the big banks. They become much more lethargic. They don't become, iterative in what they're trying to do, the technology they're trying to do, and you see that they kind of just get to this cruise control and they just collect the checks and they stay as is. And then you have those that are more the aggressors that are trying to enter into new markets. They're constantly iterating their product. And I think that's an important distinction that needs to be made in the industry, that those are the ones that I would lean to,
Mm.
because it might be a challenge because yes, they're trying to do new things undoubtedly, but staying status quo, I just don't think works, especially in fraud, right? People are just changing. I write a paper about document fraud just a couple years ago for ACFE Fraud Magazine, and now I'm rewriting it because it's totally changed. Like document fraud over the last 12, 24 months has completely changed.
Mm.
So, you need to be able to iterate, you need to be able to change. And the best in class tools are really those that continue to do that, that don't become these lethargic, monopolies that just don't iterate.
Yeah, yeah, I hear that. To switch gears a little bit, you mentioned FRAM also, obviously fraud and AML have been historically very close. Fraud is starting to work and look a lot more like cybersecurity now. What what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that I think this is another factor of AI, right? Like there was probably a technical challenge that existed among a lot of fraud folks, not that necessarily the practitioners, but the actual fraudsters, where it's like, I don't know how to create a bot, or I don't know how to write a script to be able to continue to you know, test these online marketplaces or whatever. That's just simply changed. You have all these different types of frauds that are very technical in nature. I worked with a large institution just recently where we took a look at some of the fraud that they were experiencing. It was really from an AML perspective, but this is where the crossover exists, right? Where they're asking us to look for, suspicious transactions from an AML perspective. Quickly realize that as we go through this process, that there is a fraud component existing where they're opening all these different accounts, making modifications in profiles that are slight account farming 101, right? This is a technical, very technical process where someone is managing with bots and other tools all these different accounts across all these different emails, all these different PIs that they've collected to keep this business going of whatever, whether it be a fraud case where they're scamming people and then they're collecting all this money and then they're moving it out, then at that movement process it becomes more of an AML issue versus a fraud issue. But I think the technical side is getting pretty high there. Another are areas like the bin attacks, right, where you have these bin cards that are getting attacked and they're small denominations, they're hitting these card processors and issuers thousands of transactions, but they're like under this threshold that is
Mm.
maybe nominal, or they're doing it at these periods of time where they know there's going to be, eyes not on the game, right? A weekend, an evening, a holiday, or whatever. And they're getting away with, when you collectively look at it, hundreds and thousands of dollars. But
Yeah.
individually, it's like $20, $50, $100, whatever it might be. These are very technical things that are not something that a lot of fraud investigators maybe experienced 10 years ago, 5 years ago. It is definitely getting very technical.
Defrauding the fraud investigators, fraud fighters, is it a tool they can't avoid becoming technical?
I do think that in many cases, you need to at least have some semblance of a foundation. You need to understand kind of how bots work, how AI is used to kind of iterate on maybe processes that fraudsters are using. I think you need to understand how someone can take a device and manipulate it in a way that will allow them to be able to make a payment. There's undoubtedly some technical aspects that yes, you should know. Do you need to know coding? Do you need to go get an infosec certification? Maybe not, but you should at least have some foundational skills there and
Mm.
knowledge.
Yeah. So hypothetically, you set up a fraud prevention tech company, you're looking for your first hire. What would you say the perfect fraud member would look like?
Yeah, I would say someone who, I mean, I think this industry, you need to be someone who is a almost maybe not obsessed because I would say I'm definitely obsessed with learning, but definitely very curious. You got to
Mm.
be someone who's curious. You can't think that you're going to take this job and, you're going to take those foundational skills you learned at your last job and you're going to be good. You got to be able to continue to grow and understand new technical challenges that exist. I do think that there is, yes, understanding of product and engineering that needs to be there
Right.
because you're going to be at some point maybe dependent on them or need them in your process. And so if you can't speak their language or can't take the time to understand that, that is you're not going to accomplish or be as successful as you could be. So you need to have that ability to interact with your product and engineering and your project manager folks in a way that you can understand each other. So that's something I think you definitely need in the industry. So curiosity and a technical understanding as it relates to fraud and how things are built and iterated on.
Yeah. Well, AI is going to take our jobs anyways. Let's talk about let's talk about AI. What's hype? What's real? I'd be interested to talk about the regulators. So when it comes to that side of AI and AI implementation, you have a great vantage point. What are they comfortable with when it comes to the latest AI tech?
Well, let me first say that I don't think AI is going to take our jobs. I think it's going to modify how we do our jobs.
Yeah.
The other thing is, I mean, I was just at a conference and a roundtable with some great fraud experts across the industry. And one of the things that I made sure that I pointed out is when you are using AI in a way in which you're developing models, you need to understand at that point that there needs to be governance and controls that exist. There needs to be teams that understand the guardrails and how they work and ensuring that the AI and models are performing the way they were supposed to. So I think that's a critical piece to point out is like you might think that you might gain some efficiencies, some automations, but there still needs to be some people watching, overseeing the process, just like there's always been within fraud and financial crimes. But I do think there is a lot of hype. I think I spoke to this earlier about the data, right? There's a lot of hype where people think it's going to solve something, and then they bring the AI in, and they're like, "Wait, this data is so bad that we're not seeing the efficiency gains or the automations that we were hoping for. We're still having challenges."
Mm.
So there's some of that. So there's a little bit of hype out there for sure. I think that a lot of people go into the perspective of using AI without kind of like a checklist, right? A series
Yeah.
of things you need to put in place before you deploy. So I wrote a recent blog about this and I created a very practical checklist that people can use that also aligns very well with regulators. So I think regulators are generally comfortable with the use of AI if it has audibility, right? Traceability and clear documentation around when changes are being made, who made them, why they made them, things like that. So I think there's some good regulations that are out there that give us some good guardrails. The challenge is going to be whether people actually apply those. If they're going to deploy AI, if they actually went to the regulatory language that's there, the materials that are out there, and actually applied them. I would like to think that people are doing that, but I know that they probably aren't in some cases. They're trying to just deploy fast and they don't think through the foundational steps first. So I think that's important. But again, if you have the ability to audit your trails, you explainability is there. It's not this black box. Then I think you are comfortable because at the end of the day, they're going to say like, "Why did you make this decision?" And you say, "Because the score told me to." That just isn't going to cut it. They're going to really want to understand. Okay, well, how did that score come into play? What factors was it considering? Those are the things you need to be able to understand, and then trace that customer's journey from onboarding to that decision and digestible.
Do you think that's an example of how AI is being used now, getting that score, but it will eventually be taken down, it won't be working, it won't be there, it won't be used in a couple of years' time because of what you've mentioned?
Yeah, I think we're definitely moving away from more of the black box kind of original concepts of use of AI and LLMs and so forth. I think
Mm.
as very forward, very in line, lock and step with regulators, vendors of those type, have really moved to more explainability, traceability, knowing that there's going to be an audit for these financial institutions. So I think that has definitely been the shift in the industry that we've seen. And that's really the foundational part of what we built here is at Tactile, is like this idea of saying, okay, let's understand exactly why a decision was made. Let's make sure that when they need to export this to a CSV and give it to a regulator, right, they can truly show them the step by steps that took place and why a decision was made.
Yeah. Otherwise, we'd live in a real life Minority Report,
Yeah, exactly.
which would be something else. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about this. But if there's one AI buzzword or hype that you're just tired of hearing, what would it be?
I think it would probably be just the idea that, again, AI, maybe not a kind of catchphrase, but just the idea that AI is going to solve something. I think it might not necessarily solve something. It might make things easier, but there's still a human requirement in much of what we do as it relates to AI, right? I
Mm,
think there is some autonomy that exists, right? It can gather information, it can write some basic reports or fraud typologies that are existing in your case that you're reviewing, but there's still that human component that is necessary, that is needed. And so I think there's a lot of people, as you kind of said, like AI is going to take all the jobs. I think there's been this expectation that AI is going to reduce staff dramatically. I just don't think we're there yet. Maybe there might be a different story 6 months, 12 months from now. I don't know, but I don't think it's there yet. I think there's still a lot in the financial sector across the board that one are just maybe just dabbling their feet into it, right? Or are just barely starting to implement AI. And so there's still a lot of learnings that we need to make. But can AI reduce workloads? Can it expedite processes? Can it make you more efficient? Yes, absolutely. But it isn't going to be a solve all.
I feel like it's like buying a Peloton. Like you can buy the best Peloton, the highest membership, promises you everything. But if you're not getting on it and putting the effort in, then it's not going to get you there, right? That's just
Yeah.
something that I
No
picture.
doubt. No doubt. You have to, this is where it's like you got to take a step back. Where is your biggest pain points? What in the industry has AI been successful at and maybe addressing those pain points? Like
Mm,
that's instead of again trying to solve everything, like to really be almost like a surgeon and strategically place the AI agents or AI use cases in a very systematic ways where you just have those really big challenges that exist. One example is just for credit decisioning, right? A lot of credit decisioning grabs documents from customers. There's a
mm,
ton of fraud there. There's documents that have been manipulated and edited. They haven't, these people at the end of the day, a lot of these, whether they be first party fraud or true, like synthetic or whatever, they have these ulterior motives. They want to get this access to this credit. So you can't use a human to process all these documents. You really have to use AI. And AI has done really good at taking all this kind of convoluted data, putting it together, looking for inconsistencies, calculating numbers accurately that, humans in the past maybe messed up on a calculator, right? Like
yeah.
there's so much that can be gained. It's just again being strategic and methodical about where the use cases are best placed.
I would probably describe you as a great educator, Dustin. So when you're doing this with teams, with companies, you're going in, helping them understand these platforms. Where do you start? What's your first step?
My first step is to understand my audience, right? It's always about understanding my audience. If I am going into a room with fraud or AML experts, my language and vocabulary changes when maybe I'm sitting down with an operations person or a product and engineer. Like if I'm going to a product engineer, I'm going to talk more technical, right? I'm going to talk about using the APIs and how they're going to connect and all those other technical terms, right? Versus someone in fraud or AML, I might be able to use acronyms or kind of governing concepts or other things that they're going to be familiar with. So I always start with understanding my audience. And then
Mm.
from there, one of the things that I like to do, I've always been this way. I'm a very big visual learner. I want to be able to show them
Yeah.
how the things work, right? I want to give them a visual of the connective tissue and orchestration that exists and how we think of things both theoretically as well as how they work practically. So
Mm.
those are kind of the things that I look at. But I want to always come out of the experience with someone, understanding what I'm sharing with them and really nodding their head in agreement, like this is great. This solves my problems. So those are things I obviously do a lot of due diligence before and
Yeah.
making sure I understand what challenges they're facing. Because if I go to the room and just talk in these, very large hypothetical things, it isn't going to get to the root of the problem. I need to be able to make sure I understand what challenges they're facing specifically.
So let's talk business. Let's talk on the business side. Fraud, we mentioned it a little bit earlier, fraud losses are staying around the same, but costs are climbing. So where should companies be investing right now?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. So you just have to be more strategic in the way you do your fraud deployment. So one of the things that we see a lot in the industry when we have conversations with people is, when you get down to breaking down the cost of acquisition, companies kind of start to realize, wow, this is kind of expensive the way we're doing this today. We're doing things in a way where we're paying a lot, and then we get someone down the funnel and we're like, we're not going to onboard them now, but now you just had all these front loaded costs that you just
Mm.
experienced. So we really try with our customers is, first of all, if you're front loading your APIs, you're hitting a ton of APIs right out of the gate for a customer, you're doing it wrong, in my opinion, because you're likely to probably not onboard some of those people. So let's be really strategic. What are some things that, like, very easy, low hanging fruit? Well, if someone's coming in through a VPN or showing that they're coming out of North Korea or some other sanctioned or high risk jurisdiction, are you going to onboard them? No. So why would you, let's say, have a credit check up front or an IDV for someone you're not going to onboard? Let's be strategic and really be systematic in where we create the friction, where we actually deploy the APIs. Be smart about that. And I know that might seem like a low cost factor, but when you have 100,000 onboardings or a million onboardings, like that becomes very, very expensive. Your cost of acquisition goes up, and you really want to spend the money on real customers that are actually going to use your product or your service and be of value, right? That's really important. So for us, I think it's just being very strategic around it. I think also, one of the great values that Tactile has is, like, when you go to us and if we're a reseller, you're going to get our price, right? You're not going to have an upsell. You get some real good value drivers right out of the gate.
Mm.
And then also, again, if cost is a factor, you maybe don't need a best in class, but you need something good. You have that ability to kind of go to a marketplace, right? It's like a grocery store. You go to the grocery store and, you can get the best foods mayo over there in the UK, but you're
Yeah.
probably going to pay twice as much as maybe some local brand, right? So maybe you just go with the option that works and still provides the benefit of being able to put that on your sandwich, but maybe isn't best foods mayonnaise.
Mm.
Not a big deal. But those are the things. You still get what you need, but maybe you want to be more strategic in your cost factors.
Okay, I'm getting strategic's the headline there. Well, Dustin, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. We're at the start of the year. If we're talking fraud, what's one thing you would stop? What's one thing that you would start? What's one thing as an industry we should continue as well? So stop, start, continue.
Yeah, I would probably say stop avoiding hard work. Like, go in there and, one of the things that I do, like, from a physical perspective, is I do Spartans, right? So one of the things that Spartans teaches you is you need to be able to recognize that when you take on really challenging things, mentally, physically, right? It just builds a tolerance, an ability to do more hard things. So, don't avoid the hard work that's in front of you. If that's learning, if that's unraveling a system and getting a new one, just don't avoid that. Don't avoid the hard work. I think one of the things that you want to do is you want to, if you have been avoiding it, pick up a book, pick up some learning, learn from others. There's so much that is out there. So one of the things I would do is just level up your learning in this new year. Level it up. There's a lot of awesome people in the industry that know way more than I do, and I always go to the room humble and willing to learn, and
Yeah.
that's what I would say is just keep learning. Now, continue to know that your work matters. It can get frustrating. It can get monotonous maybe in some cases, but just know that there is some gleaming moments that exist in our industry. I posted one on LinkedIn a few days ago about there was a gentleman who got arrested for purchasing inappropriate material, and luckily transaction monitoring at that cryptocurrency was working, and someone at the end of the day was doing their job, and they sent that over to authorities, and that person was arrested, right? So those were one of those gleaming moments where it's like my work mattered.
Yeah.
So that's something I would want to say to the industry overall.
Amazing. What a point to finish on. Dustin, thank you. If people want to catch up with what you're doing, your blogs, your articles, any events,
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. I'm definitely have quite a few speaking opportunities coming up. I got a lot of articles getting published, both with ACFE Fraud and ACAMS Today, as well as the Compliance and Ethics Professionals magazine. I would just say, find me on LinkedIn, connect with me. Love to chat anytime. I answer most of my messages as quickly as I can, but that's where I usually share a lot of my material and upcoming events.
well, it's been a pleasure and thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, pleasure is mine. Thank you again.
Awesome. And to the listeners, until next time, ciao for now. Want to hear more about fighting fraud with tech? Subscribe to Leading Detection wherever you get your podcasts.